From SBI's Executive Briefing Center in Dallas, Texas, the most watched and listened to content in B2B sales and marketing, it's the SBI Podcast with your host, Matt Shares.
Hey everybody, welcome to the SBI TV show, a weekly show dedicated to helping you make your number. So I'm Matt Shares, the CEO of SBI. I will be your host. And today, I got a great show planned for you. In our ever-changing world, we as leaders are constantly being bombarded with trends, data, assumptions, and tools, right? The new things. We find ourselves in a world of information, overloading, coming fact from fiction, and we struggle to get the clean data necessary to make decisions. However, I'm pleased to say we have a renowned expert who can help us with this very issue. So, Frank Cespedes, professor at Harvard Business School, writer, Harvard Business Review, also an author of a new book, which I'm holding in my hand, Sales Management That Works, How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing, is joining us. The cool thing about Frank, other than the fact that he is no bullshit, and I'm not supposed to say that, but it's my show and I can, Frank's also in HBR right here, and if my hands were bigger, and they're actually pretty big, I would hold up more of Frank's writing, but I can't, and his book is thick, so you actually have to be able to read to get through it. So Frank, my man, good to see you. Thank you for being here and for contributing to the go-to-market profession.
Matt, my thanks to you, and I mean that sincerely. I've been a fan of SBI for some time.
Well, the feeling is mutual, and anybody that is good enough to get continually published and be a contributing author at that small school known as Harvard, and the publication is HBR, is beyond credible, so we're thrilled to have you on the show. So, Frank, one of the things, and obviously I read your last book a few years ago, one of the things I loved about this book is the way you go after separating fact from fiction. And as you and I chatted about a couple months ago when we were kicking around this idea, is coming out of a pandemic, everybody's looking for a silver bullet. Everybody's looking to separate fact from fiction. But I guess maybe just level set from the vantage point of the CEO. Where should they be paying attention and what should they be paying attention to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, you can't run a profit-making enterprise without an effective customer acquisition and customer retention mechanism. So the short, and perhaps it may sound like the glib answer, is the CEO needs to be paying attention all the time on an ongoing basis. And frankly, CEOs who need an excuse to do that, like a pandemic or a downturn, are, they're in trouble way before that. The reality is, however, that many CEOs are out of touch. You held up that HBR article, and you'll see the data in there. Fewer people than ever before have made it to the C-suite, including the position of CEO, without any sustained background in marketing and sales. Heidrick and Struggles charts this every year. 2 years ago, they stopped listing marketing and sales backgrounds as a separate category because there were so few. Yeah. The CEO suite is now dominated by people in finance and especially in tech sectors in engineering. That's a big issue and it has consequences.
So Frank, and it's funny, we did a body of work last year, one of my colleagues, Kyle Bushy, on those with a sales background ascending to the CEO role and their performance and how they were outperforming. While the sample set was small, right, the performance metrics were key as we looked at return on equity and their ability to drive true value creation. I guess when I think about this book, and for those that don't have a copy, I'm holding it in my hands, and you can also get it, read it on your iPad. I got both, just saying. But Frank, you delve into people, right? I mean, you delve into the P's, right? And we're going to step through that. But most CEOs will say, I'm worried about my talent. I think about what we do and where I sit at the intersection and go to market, talk to a CEO, right? Anytime if they come to a visit here in Dallas or on the telephone, they will always be saying, hey, how good do you think my team is? So when you think about the talent in the CEO role, to be spotting talent to run the commercial team, run sales, run marketing, what are you seeing? Do a little fact-fiction separation for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, one of the first things that a CEO or anyone else looking at sales needs to understand is that sales is very, very context specific. Now, when I say this, what I notice is that most executives, when I tell them this, nod their heads. But quite honestly, Matt, it has been astounding to me in my career how often smart, well-educated people forget this. Right. Of all the functions in business, sales is the most context specific. Selling software is different than selling consumer durables, different than professional services. Selling enterprise software is different than software as a service. Depends on to whom and where you're selling. Selling in North America different than in South America and Asia. So when you're looking for a sales leader, you need to recognize that. You need to know what you're looking for. Now, that's why the CEO needs to pay attention. If and when the CEO or the C-suite is out of touch with the important questions to ask about their sales model, as it works today, not yesterday, they're going to have trouble hiring the sales leader. And then the second thing I would do is just point out one of the standard ways that many companies go about finding the sales leader and why it's a risky route. Very often what they'll do is say, well, we're going to hire the star from X. And, virtually every executive has the experience. Somehow, she was great at X. We brought her here and it didn't work out. Now, why was that? It is not as though that person suddenly got stupid or lost their capabilities. But stardom is not easily portable in business in general, and especially in sales, because the effectiveness of a sales leader depends not just on their ability to hire and do things externally with customers. It depends on the internal relationships that they've established with others. And when you hire someone from X, they've got to recreate that. And it's your job in the senior levels is to accelerate that process.
Frank, that is such a great point. Two quick follow-ups and if I could build on that. One is we've coined that around SBI is the red wagon effect. If you think about when you're a little kid and you got your red wagon at the park and you've got all your toys, you come in and your red wagon, you got a pail, right? And you've got some water and you've got a baseball. That's your narrative. You come with all that stuff. But you walk into an entirely new set of circumstances, and the failure rate that we see oftentimes, to your point, it isn't because the person isn't capable. The other 50%, so there's 50% talent, is the performance conditions. And you and I are going to talk about model, right? And what does that mean? How do you contextualize the model? How do you evolve the model? Because stage appropriate. Right? Sometimes you need a builder. When you're getting started, or if you have your first round of private equity money, somebody who can operate in that, versus if you're a large public company, right? You got to do a lot of consensus building. It's almost part-time politician, part-time commercial leader because of the nature of the organization, right? Business units, et cetera. So that I totally agree with you.
No, I agree, and I'd actually generalize a little bit more. And again, once I say this to executives, their heads nod, but they forget it. In business in general, and sales in particular, there is no such thing as performance in the abstract. There's only performance here in our context, not there. So you're exactly right about that.
So Frank, let's in this segment, I'd like to shift out of people. We could talk about that one for hours, but let's maybe shift to the model. And you spend quite a bit of time both in the article, shortened version, but then in the book, obviously. And so many people are either shifting their revenue model, shifting their go-to-market model, doing both, and always sort of tinkering and looking, especially over the last 12 months with what's happened, where everyone's been sort of put back on their back foot. So from your vantage point, how should the CEO be thinking about the go-to-market model right now? Like, what lens would you give them?
I'd make a couple of points, Matt. The first thing is the perennial point. Then let me talk about the pandemic in particular. But the perennial point is this: the most important thing about selling in any market is the buyer. Who buys, why, and how. And that's where technology, the sustained data revolution that will continue throughout our careers and lifetimes, that's where it's having the biggest impact. Buyers are now online and offline at multiple times throughout their buying journey. And that's where sales models need to focus and respond to. Now, the pandemic in particular, I think, is a very, very important issue for many companies' sales models because it makes getting it right a strategic issue as well as an ongoing perennial sales management issue. First thing to notice is that this has not been an equal opportunity plague.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to use some of the language from gangster movies, but there are certain sectors and verticals that have been whacked. All right. Verticals that their business depends on bringing people together. And there have been others. Think about many, many tech businesses.
Right.
Unfortunately, this has been a great boon for them because of virtual this and virtual that. That is going to linger for some time, even when we're all vaccinated. Now, let me tie this to strategy. I'm going to use some MBA jargon. I hope that's okay.
That is totally okay.
But one of the core elements of any strategy is what strategists call scope. That's their jargon for the decisions that companies make, explicitly or implicitly, about where we play and where we don't. What I find I need to remind CEOs about is that the scope decision in your strategy is not made by you and a couple of other senior people sitting in a room talking. That's called brainstorming. In practice, scope decisions are made by the aggregate call patterns of the sales force. Do you understand where your salespeople are calling? Do you understand what incentives they have to call on X rather than Y? Coming out of the pandemic, that's a crucial issue because, if you think about it, the single biggest driver of cash in most businesses is the selling cycle.
No doubt.
Right? And that's the big issue that many of these folks face as they try to restart and rejump growth coming out.
Well, and Frank, one of my old partners used to always say that customers vote with their wallets, right?
Yeah.
So it's fine to say this or feel this or whatever. At the end of the day, right? Like you said, be fanatical about how the buyer or the customer experiences a product after they procure. But number two, people vote with their wallets. Because even going through the pandemic, people found money, found budget, right? As a traditional seller would want to say, for those things that matter. But you had to be in the critical path. Which then leads me, so in this next segment, Frank, I'd like to talk, in the book, you do a really nice job of talking about pricing, right? And pricing power. And the way to help people sort of think about evolving that. From your perspective and what you've seen, where are CEOs missing the boat with their CFOs when it comes to pricing? Because not many salespeople have the ability to change price on what it is they sell, right? You do what you are told as a seller. So thoughts on that?
Well, first, let's start with the salespeople, Matt. Not only do many of them not have the ability, but when they have the ability, if you look at their compensation systems, they're typically not asking for higher prices.
Right.
It's usually lower price, right? So, perhaps they should not have the ability. Now, you mentioned both CEOs and CFOs. Let's break that apart because I think there are interesting developments affecting both. The CEO sets the foundational conditions for so much of what happens in business development, including pricing. Now, I think what CEOs need to understand, and this generalization will obviously vary by industry, but I think it holds as a generalization. The reality is that the data analytics that are now available to companies, and they are available. If companies are not using them, it's their fault. It's not the fault of the technology. Those analytics actually increase the opportunities for value-based pricing versus the typical cost plus.
Yep.
And a lot of CEOs are surprised by that because they say, oh, Amazon, others, it's just a race to the bottom. Not true. And if I can sell the book for a moment, look at the examples in those chapters about pricing. However, the unit of value in many businesses is changing. Mm-hmm. And that's the role of the sales force. They have to keep in touch with that. I would point out one other thing about pricing vis-a-vis the CEO. Then I'll talk about the CFO for a moment. The tools available to test prices have increased exponentially in the last decade. And those tools are way beyond the typical surveys that companies use. And one thing we know for sure from research is that what people say and what their actual behavior is in the marketplace is not a one-to-one correlation. Right? Surveys are risky. Now we have tools, A/B tests, other things, where you can actually look at behavior. But there's a surprising amount of inertia about this. And as far as I can tell, the pandemic, ironically, has increased that inertia. As companies batten down the hatches, they actually do less testing because there's risk and we need to focus on X. They shouldn't.
Yep.
Now, you also asked about CFOs.
Yeah.
This is a big issue. Because of the data revolution, sales, which in many companies was basically a black box, right? Now it's much more transparent, especially to the CFO. And as you know, Matt, finance people are annoying. Once they get data, they start to ask questions.
Amen. Sounds like you know my CFO.
That's right. The requirements for financial literacy in sales are increasing dramatically. And conversely, this is an important cross-functional dialogue that has to happen in many companies. CFOs are good at data analysis, and so are their people. They don't necessarily know a thing about the actual sales models in their firms. And they need to know that if they're going to get any answers from the data analysis.
Frank, if I could build on that, you were chatting with Melissa before the show. So we've been doing what we call growth forums, roundtables for years. And we would have CEOs, bring them together as a cohort, chief commercial officers who have big scopes, chief revenue officers, chief marketing officers. Last year, we started doing a chief financial officer growth forum. And the content and our practice lead, Jim Adamarna, runs that. The richness of the conversation, but the growing desire, especially from those that are in private equity-owned companies, because of the bet of so many of these middle market companies, there's no cost to take out. If you're going to grow valuation, someone's got to sell more stuff. So the CFO's got to truly be the right hand to the CEO and the chief revenue officer as they think about capital allocation.
Yeah. But even below the CFO, Matt, if you look at sales ops functions, very fast growing function, especially in tech firms, almost half of those people have never carried a bag.
Right.
And they don't report to the CRO.
Right.
They report to data analytics, who in turn reports up to the finance function. This is a dialogue that is increasingly important.
So, Frank, let me. I want to talk a little bit about the book. So we've hit some of the key components, but before I let you go, what was the trigger event? What was the impetus to write this one? Like, why now? I mean, it's not like you're looking for things to do, but tell us about that.
Well, I mean, I had two motivations. The first I sort of alluded to earlier, Matt. Sales is the most context-specific part of business, yet for some reason, it's that part of business where people feel most comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data beyond, as we say in academia, N equals 1. When I worked and sold at Google, when we invested in PayPal. After 30 years of looking at this, running a business, I wanted to write a book that says, look, this is what research does and doesn't tell you about this core activity in business. And I do think it's a good time to write it because there's no doubt that the data revolution, digital technologies are having an impact on buying and selling. But my reading of what people say about that is that they, most of the time, simply misunderstand the managerial implications.
Right.
And again, I think the pandemic has raised the stakes for separating hype from fact.
Yeah. Well, Frank, here's what I would tell you. It is, having followed you and read your last book, right, Aligning Strategy and Sales, and now this, it's a real treat to have you on the show. As a firm that only focuses on revenue growth and go-to-market, that's what we've been doing every day for almost 2 decades. It's great to meet somebody in the world of academia who leans in and speaks the lingua franca. So thank you for taking the time to spend with us. Congratulations on a great piece of work yet again, both the captions in HBR, but for those that are watching and listening, this is worth it. And it's more of a textbook that you can dig into to run the business than it is just a book because Frank didn't have anything to do. As you can tell, he's hard-hitting, East Coaster, he speaks the truth. So thanks for coming on the show.
Matt, flattery will get you everywhere with me. Thanks to you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You got it, my man. I'll see you soon. All right, everybody. There you have it. So despite the fact that Frank's on the East Coast and I'm in Texas and I live on the West Coast, we certainly do share similar opinions when it comes to the importance of the commercial function. So for those CEOs taking a watch and a listen, Frank really hits it hard relative to talent as you think about the ever-changing model, pricing, just some really, really good takeaways. So until next time, I wish you good luck as you try and make your number.
This has been the SBI Podcast. For more information on the studio, SBI's Executive Briefing Center, our team, or to schedule a workshop, please visit salesbenchmarkindex.com.